Hello friends, today I will be discussing The Animal That Therefore I Am, in French, L'animal que donc je suis, by Jacques Derrida. Before I get into it, I do want to give a very brief background on Derrida and the text. The Animal That Therefore I Am was originally presented as a lecture at a conference at Cerisy-la-Salle. The actual lecture, given in French, is on YouTube. So I'm going to go ahead and add the link in the description for anyone who might be interested, though I do warn you that the sound quality is quite poor, so be ready for that. Most essentially, this text is calling into question the concept of the animal as it has been used in the history of philosophy. More specifically, Derrida explores the way the animal has been portrayed from the Abrahamic traditions to Cartesianism and into the present day. For those who don't know, Derrida is most famous for his method of deconstruction, which appears quite substantially in this text. Deconstruction is essentially a critical approach to understanding texts and their meanings, playing on the hierarchically dichotomous structure of language. The primary focus is to find the central or axiomatic concepts in a given text and to show how these are representative of and interwoven with pre-existing hierarchies of meaning. For example, a discourse on the subject necessarily holds implications about the object, much like other binaries like soul and body, reason and passion, logos and pathos, human and animal. While there's much more I could say about deconstruction, I'm not going to do that here. That's not the purpose of this video. However, if you're new to deconstruction, I would recommend reading The Introduction to Speech and Phenomena by Jacques Derrida, or even just looking up some YouTube videos explaining deconstruction. There's plenty of good ones out there. That being said, this video does discuss a very clear deconstruction of Immanuel Kant, which I think should be quite useful for beginners looking to understand deconstruction. So before jumping into the text, I do want to share a few quick notes. This presentation works very closely with the text, and accordingly, I will have quotes up on the screen for you to read along. With that said, some of these quotes were quite long, so I added a few filler words which serve to paraphrase, not to insert my interpretation. I always did my best to stay as close to the intended meaning of the text as possible. I do recommend pausing the video for some of the longer quotes, as they can be quite dense and deserve very close reading. Also, if you have the text, I would recommend reading along directly, and I will have the page numbers on each slide for anyone who wants to note the passages. With all of that said, we can go ahead and get right into the text. The setting of this text is quite notably in an encounter Jacques Derrida had with his cat. The entirety of this text can be said to emerge from this encounter, where Derrida, naked in his bathroom, is confronted by the gaze of his cat. It is somewhere in the eyes of Jacques Derrida's cat that the word compassion echoes like a call, a cry, a confusion, a question, a response. Derrida, who saw these eyes, fell deeply into their gaze. In them he saw himself seen in a state of nudity, and out of an emergent sense of vulnerability and shame, saw his own need to speak about and on behalf of this animal, the animal, and what he would call l'animal. Seeing as he was inescapably ensnared in this interspecific gaze, he wrote The Animal That Therefore I Am in an autobiographical attempt to describe, understand, and deconstruct the innumerable layers of meaning he found in this insightful experience. It would be impossible to discuss all of these layers here. Instead, I will focus on those wherein the word compassion seems to arise as a vital impulse that brings Derrida's text to life. Accordingly, my primary aim in this video will be to provide an in-depth analysis of Derrida's use and discussion of the word compassion as it is presented in The Animal That Therefore I Am. I will argue that this compassion is inextricably interwoven with Derrida's concepts of pouvoir, war, sacrifice, time, and technology, as these are presented in the same text. To do so, I will show that these unified words and concepts form a crucial thread with which Derrida sews together his deconstructions of Descartes, Kant's, and Levinas's discourses on the animal. More specifically, each of these deconstructions suggests that the relevant thinker's discourse violates compassion by way of a sacrificial war against the animal, animals, and l'animal, and that this violation is also implicated in and amplified by their discourses on time and technology. Ultimately, I will suggest that Derrida's discussion of compassion is as intellectual and metaphorical as it is practical and tangible, and that there are profound implications to be found in each of these interconnected domains. Before turning to compassion, it is necessary to clarify Derrida's invented word, l'animal, for it provides a guiding framework for his entire text. This word, best left untranslated, is a play on the French word for animals, animaux, and the French word for word, mot. It is audibly indistinguishable from the plural, animaux. By placing the singular determiner, the, in front of animaux, Derrida renders the plural sounding animaux singular. This invention of the word l'animal has three primary aims. First, the singularization of an audibly plural word is meant to point to the plethora of vastly diverse and distinct living beings that are problematically placed together into the homogeneous category of the animal. Further, he adds that this categorization, quote, is not simply a sin against rigorous thinking, vigilance, lucidity, or empirical authority. It is also a crime against animals themselves, end quote. Second, the use of mot holds two main meanings. On the one hand, it is meant to point to the fact that the animal is primarily and simply a word, linking it to the nature of words as such. On the other hand, it emphasizes the centrality of the word or language in general in conventional discourse meant to distinguish humans from animals. Herein is implied both the attribution of the word to the human and its privation from the animal. Third, l'animal aims at a reconsideration of this privation and the ways of thinking that are associated with it, inviting humans to try to think about animals, themselves, and even thinking itself in new ways. Many more words could be said about Derrida's animaux, yet most of these must remain unworded here. From here on, I will use l'animal for my analysis of Derrida, and any use of the animal or animals should be considered intentional. I will now turn to compassion, as it is introduced in relation to l'animal early on in the text. The earliness of this introduction is significant in itself in that it establishes compassion as a central and guiding concept for the remainder of the work. It's also noteworthy that while the actual word compassion appears 12 times in the whole text, 9 of these uses are found in this introductory passage. Importantly, compassion is introduced together with war, sacrifice, pouvoir, time, and technology in a way that weaves these words together definitionally. As such, the word compassion is implicitly present in earlier and later cases where the other words are discussed together without its explicit mention. This introduction of compassion is found in what Derrida calls a first hypothesis, suggesting that, quote, for about 2 centuries, intensely and by means of an alarming rate of acceleration, for we no longer have a clock or chronological measure of it, we who call ourselves men or humans have been involved in an unprecedented transformation affecting the experience of the animal and or animals. He adds that, however one names this alteration, no one could deny that it has been accelerating, intensifying, no longer knowing where it is going, for about 2 centuries, at an incalculable rate and level. Why say ambiguously, he asks, for about 2 centuries, as if such a point of reference were rigorously possible within a process that is no doubt as old as man, what he calls his world, his knowledge, his history, and his technology? He answers simply and preliminarily that it is in order to recall what allows us to understand and agree in saying us today. Of course, in the Derridean fashion, the answer becomes more complex. Framed in this way, it can be seen that the hypothesis concerns men or humans, l'animal, an unprecedented transformation of the two, and the past 2 centuries, roughly, within a process that is no doubt as old as man, what he calls his world, his knowledge, his history or story, and his technology. Already, then, time and technology are brought in meaningful ways. The hypothesis concerns time itself as humans conceptualize it, but also time in a process that is co-primordial with man along with his oldest and newest components of self-understanding. Here it remains unclear whether this process refers to temporality itself, the ongoing transformation of the past 2 centuries, or both of these. This requires further analysis that is to come. In any case, the important point is that time and technology play an essential role in an ongoing, accelerating, and profound transformation of humans that affects, among many other things, l'animal. Derrida describes the effects of this transformation on animals explicitly and tellingly. Quote, "It is all too evident that in the course of the last 2 centuries, the traditional forms of treatment of the animal have been turned upside down by the joint developments of zoological, ethological, biological, and genetic forms of knowledge, which remain inseparable from techniques of intervention into the living animal by means of genetic experimentation, the industrialization of what can be called the production for consumption of animal meat, more and more audacious manipulations of the genome, the reduction of the animal to production and overactive reproduction of meat for consumption, of other end products, all in the service of a certain being and the putative well-being of man." He adds that no one can deny this event or its unprecedented proportions that previous generations would have judged monstrous. The monstrosity of this event can be found in a disturbing analogy. Quote, "As if, for example, instead of throwing a people into ovens and gas chambers, let's say Nazi doctors and geneticists had decided to organize the overproduction and overgeneration of Jews, gypsies, and homosexuals by means of artificial insemination so that they could be destined in always increasing numbers for the same hell, that of the imposition of genetic experimentation or extermination by gas or by fire." Keeping this analogy in mind, he goes on to say that everybody knows what terrifying and intolerable pictures a realist painting could give to the industrial, mechanical, chemical, hormonal, and genetic violence to which man has been submitting animal life for the past 2 centuries. Such images need not be seen to understand their relation to the pathos, for if these images are pathetic and evoke sympathy, it is because they pathetically open the immense question of pathos, that is, of suffering, pity, and compassion, and the place that has to be accorded to this interpretation of this compassion, to the sharing of this suffering among the living. This event of the past 2 centuries now involves a new experience of this compassion in which certain marginal voices aim to awaken us to our responsibilities and obligation toward the living in general and the fundamental compassion that, taken seriously, would revolutionize the philosophical problematic of the animal. In this dense passage, a few significant points must be brought out. The transformation he describes refers most simply to the industrialization of animal agriculture, which has a genocidal character to it. Curiously and significantly, he calls this transformation an event. Accordingly, the transformation is not a mere phenomenon or process, but a constitutive event of the history and the story of man, by which the past 2 centuries earn their own classification, following the human tendency to compartmentalize time historically into a distinctive chapter of time in the historical story of man. This new chapter is defined by the transformative role of technology manifesting itself by way of a fundamental, denaturalizing, and monstrous metamorphosis not only of l'animal, but also and importantly of humans and the human more generally. As newly developed human techniques reconstruct the genomic, organizational, and behavioral structures of animals in a way that, rendered into a realist painting, everybody would find terrifying and intolerable, an equally radical and corresponding alteration of the human experience arises. This is the experience of the fundamental compassion found in the pathos, the pity, and the suffering evoked as much in the supposed realist painting as in the event it depicts. Compassion, then, is contextually defined by this event in a time whose guiding force is that of technology and techno-scientific forms of knowing. Here Derrida brings up Jeremy Bentham, who for Derrida proposed changing the very form of the question regarding the animal in the dominant traditional discourse. The question should no longer be whether the animal can think, reason, or speak, but rather as a first and decisive question, to know whether animals can suffer. The guiding verb here, to be able to, translates to the French pouvoir. The very same word, pouvoir, in French also means power, and thus Derrida's use of this verb in French contains more obviously a double entendre through which these questions appear to be concerned equally with ability and power. The play on this word comes out more strongly in a subsequent passage. Quote, "Being able to suffer is no longer a power. It is a possibility without power, a possibility of the impossible. Mortality resides there as the most radical means of thinking the finitude that we share with animals, the mortality that belongs to the very finitude of life, to the experience of compassion, to the possibility of sharing the possibility of this non-power, the possibility of this impossibility, the anguish of this vulnerability, and the vulnerability of this anguish." This oscillation between ability and power implied in Derrida's use of the word pouvoir remains present in the questions concerning thought and suffering that nourish Derrida's question of compassion. By way of this double entendre, compassion is linked to the shared mortality, finitude, and possibility of being unable and or powerless found equally in human and non-human animals. These shared and codependent attributes give rise to the anguish experienced by their recognition, while the anguish itself is vulnerable to the ease with which humans disavow and ignore it, along with the shared attributes it arises from. With these ideas in mind, Derrida returns to the question of animal suffering, asserting that it leaves no room for doubt, that in fact it has never left any room for doubt. The simple and undeniable response to the question is, yes, they suffer, like us who suffer for them and with them, in a response that precedes the indubitable, and even that precedes all other questions. In the undeniability of this response emerges an axiomatic shift of the ground and cornerstone of the philosophical problem of the animal. This undeniability is intended to be similar to, yet more certain than, some undeniabilities proclaimed by Descartes, such as his cogito, I think, therefore I am, the fact that human language proves other humans share this ability, that non-human animals cannot speak, think, reason, etc. In this sense, Derrida's shift from the question of animal thought to the question of animal suffering is centrally a critique of Descartes' cogito. Much like the title of the text, "The Animal That Therefore I Am," is a subtle critique of Descartes' "I think, therefore I am." Consequently, the philosophical problem of the animal no longer rests on the old, supposedly natural ground or historic and artifactual cornerstone or foundation. To conclude this passage, Derrida returns to the event of the past 2 centuries. This event, he says, is situated in, quote, "an unequal struggle, a war, whose inequality could one day be reversed, being waged between, on the one hand, those who violate not only animal life, but even and also the sentiment of compassion, and on the other hand, those who appeal for an irrefutable testimony to this pity." War is waged over the matter of pity. This war is probably ageless, but, and here is my hypothesis, it is passing through a critical phase. We are passing through that phase, and it passes through us. To think the war we find ourselves waging is not only a duty, a responsibility, an obligation, it is also a necessity, a constraint that no one can escape. Henceforth, more than ever, and I say to think this war because I believe it concerns what we call thinking. The animal looks at us, and we are naked before it. thinking perhaps begins there. Another defining characteristic of the event, then, is this war being fought over suffering, pity, and compassion. On one side are those who violate animal life and in turn violate compassion, advocating the perpetuity and necessity of this violation and violence. On the other side are those who call for an end to these violations and violence by advocating an undeniable responsibility toward the sentiment of compassion. The critical phase of this war emerges from the unprecedented, immeasurable, and accelerating character of the transformations occurring in the human and l'animal in the midst of this event, amplifying the magnitude and scale at which the war is fought over compassion. Yet while the war may be in a critical phase, it remains ageless and in turn timeless, pointing to its primordiality in the development of the human. The war precedes the technology-driven event of the past 2 centuries, as well as the event itself as a human conception of time that categorizes time in terms of the history and story of the human. The war is a central defining characteristic of the human, and even, perhaps, of thinking itself. And when l'animal looks at the human fighting this war, seeing the human in a state of nudity, this is the moment when, perhaps, thinking begins. Keeping this war and all its implications in mind, it is worth recalling that this whole text is guided by Derrida's experience of being seen and being seen in a state of nudity by his cat. So to summarize what we have so far, it has been shown that Derrida's concept of compassion is defined in a particular context. This context is one that calls the industrialization of animal agriculture a technology-driven event in the history and story of the human. In the same context, the philosophical problem of the animal is shifted from the question of whether they can think to the question of whether they can suffer, both of which are posed in terms of the double entendre found in the French verb pouvoir. This shift reveals an ongoing and ageless war over compassion and against l'animal, currently in a critical phase that is a central defining characteristic of the human and perhaps of thinking itself. The event that defines the critical phase of the war is laden with the killing and in turn the sacrifice of animals and l'animal. Derrida's concept of compassion then is defined explicitly in relation to his concepts of pouvoir, time, technology, war, and sacrifice. Turning now to his Deconstruction of Kant, will reveal an implicit and similar discussion of compassion by way of the central presence of these concepts of pouvoir, time, technology, war, and sacrifice. Derrida begins what he calls a reprise of the Cartesian cogito by Kant's I think. Kant defines man as he who can possess the representation of an I. This I is a power, which is not simply posited by Kant as an attribute or consequence, one among others, of this I. Rather, this power over animals is the essence of the I or the person, the essence of the human. Understanding this ability or power is also a matter of questioning oneself concerning the axiom that permits one to accord purely and simply to the human or the rational animal what the just plain animal is deprived of. This questioning is linked with the question of the I am following, je suis, or I think, which should then be displaced toward the prerequisite question of the other me that I am following, or that is following me. Kant faces this question by way of sociality and the direct comparison between animal and human society. In this comparison, he concedes an analogy to a beehive, wherein the two socialities are similar in that it is a matter of being destined to become a member of a cooperative and civil society. Yet the comparison ceases where these hive insects commit to a war that, according to Kant, cannot be compared to human wars. This war aims to remain in the bellicose state of nature, in a relation of ruse, violence, and exploitation of the strength of others, whereas human wars bring about a transition from wild nature to the state of society. Derrida cites Kant, who says that this human war is distinct from that of bees in that it is the incentive to pass from the crude state of nature to the civil state. Kant also adds that this incentive is what is rendered from the German to the French to English as a mechanical device of providence. This what's-it or thingamajig foresees the finality of these two wars based on animality. The Kantian distinction of the human from the animal found in the passage is the ability or power of the I think at the essence of the human. By the fact that it is fundamentally an ability or power, this I think alludes to the earlier discussion concerning the questions of animal thought and suffering, along with all the implications found therein. What will be of more importance in the upcoming discussion of Levinas is that this, I think, also concerns the question of the other in all of its importance and complexity. Moreover, this, I think, is grounded by Kant in a discussion of war, where the fundamentally defining and distinguishing characteristic of human war is a developmental mechanism driving humans away from nature and toward the more advanced and modern civil state. As such, while it may not be explicit or obvious yet, Kant's war is bound up with Derrida's ideas of war and technology. Perhaps less obviously, it is bound up with Derrida's ideas of time and sacrifice. All of these connections will be shown more clearly in the forthcoming analysis. But before turning to these passages, it's important to recall that by its relation to these Derridian concepts of pouvoir, war, time, technology, and sacrifice, Kant's discourse on the I think is also a discourse on compassion. Continuing his analysis of Kant's war, Derrida suggests that Kant himself seems to blur or even discredit the line he draws to distinguish human and animal wars. This is when Kant evokes the possibility that one day in a third epoch, the chimpanzee might be able to say, I think. In this possibility lies the implication that there would be three different eras. In the first era, prior to history, in a time before time, in the state of pure nature, the human baby didn't cry at birth. In the second era, without our knowing how or why, says Kant, quite literally, on the day that parents accede to culture, nature makes the disturbing cry of the newborn possible, no doubt within the perspective of speech. In the third era, which Derrida says would require a redistribution of the whole logic of this anthropocentrism, and by extension, Kant's whole work, is found a hypothesis. This is the hypothesis that, in Kant's words cited by Derrida, quote, an orangutan or a chimpanzee could develop the organs used for walking, handling objects, and speaking into the structure of a human being, whose innermost part contained an organ for the use of understanding and which develops through social culture. What this hypothesis points to, according to Derrida, is an opening to an evolutionary process that is even historical, a macro-dimensional periodization of homonization and beyond. Derrida adds that this hypothesis has the status of a reverie with no tomorrow, resembling Levinas's cursory remark about Bobby, the Kantian dog, in that it is without a future within the discourse in which it appears. Here I want to emphasize the invocation of Derrida's concept of time as a process of categorization of the history and story of the human. Kant's division into three eras or epochs is a direct manifestation of this concept of time. This periodization includes a time prior to history and a time before time, a time, era, or one day when human culture emerges, and a time of reverie with no tomorrow, when the animal could become the human. This evolutionary view of time seems to be in line with the developmental mechanism of war that drives the human away from nature and towards civility in Kant's discourse. Until the animal reaches this unreachable third era, it remains excluded from the I think, from the rationality, liberty, and autonomy found therein, and in turn, from the ability or power to be a recipient of Kantian moral rights. In Derrida's words, the animal, and even the animality in man, cannot be taken to be an end in itself, but only a means. As such, it belongs to the purely sensible order of existence that must always be sacrificed, the word always used by Kant, when speaking of the subordination of interests and vital or sensible passions. Accordingly, the non-rational is deprived of what Kant calls dignity, what in other words is an internal and priceless value, the value of an end in itself, or perhaps preferably, a price above any market price. The concept of the animal in Derrida's presentation of Kant is sacrificed due to its lack of an I think or rationality for the sake of morality. This Kantian morality, as is well known, is founded upon the inherent value of human dignity. When Derrida reformulates this value into one that transcends a market price, he points to the entailed permissibility of the commodification of non-dignified animality. Equivalently, he subtly references a link between this view of dignity and the commodification of animals found both before and within the event of industrialized animal agriculture. Anything that is not human is commodifiable into a mere means to whatever end it can serve, where this end can become, as it has, the unbounded mass consumption of goods or the market growth such consumption entails. This is where the virtual cruelty of this pure critical reason emerges, a cruelty similar or equivalent to the accents of cruelty that already mark Kant's discourse in its imperative necessity of sacrificing sensibility to moral reason. Further, this sacrificial cruelty can become so much more serious against the animal that some, such as Theodor Adorno, denounce it as an extreme violence, even a sort of sadism. In Derrida's paraphrase of this denunciation, Adorno interprets this concept of dignity as an act of war and a gesture of hate, an animosity as though Kant were raising the stakes in a bid to envenom the Cartesian project of indifference to the animal machine. In an immediate, parenthetical, yet immensely relevant response, Derrida adds a note that provides tremendous and telling support for the centrality of compassion in this text, adding an immense polemical layer of complexity to his work. Quote, "I don't believe it for a moment. I think that Cartesianism belongs beneath its mechanistic indifference to the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition of a war against the animal, of a sacrificial war that is as old as Genesis. And that war is not just one means of applying technoscience to the animal in the absence of another possible or foreseeable means. No, that violence or war has until now been constitutive of the project or of the very possibility of techno-scientific knowledge within the process of humanization or of the appropriation of man by man, including its most highly developed ethical or religious forms. No ethical or sentimental nobility must be allowed to conceal from us that violence, and acknowledged forms of ecologism or vegetarianism are insufficient to bring it to an end, however more worthy they be than what they oppose." Returning to Kant and Adorno, Derrida adds that in the principle and ends of Kant's morality there would be death, putting to death, and murder in the form of sacrifice, to the extent that one could say that a bad will, even a perverse malice, inhabits and animates the so-called good moral will. Ultimately, Kantian thinking regarding evil should be reinterpreted from this point of view. So, in its foundation, the I think at the essence of the human is an ability or power that is inaccessible to the animal. As such, the I think is a prioritization of the question of animal thought over the question of animal suffering in terms of ability or power. This I think is supported and driven by a divinely ordained mechanism of war that propels the human away from the state of nature towards a more developmentally advanced and modern state of civil sociality. The developments of this war may be found in Kant's categorization of time into eras, distinguishingly characterized by their own significant events of the history and story of the human, wherein the human transitions from the state of pure nature of the first era to the state of culture of the second era. In this categorization is also a paradoxical possibility of a third era in which the animal could gain access to the essential structural attributes that would make it human. The paradox of this third era emerges from Kant's assignment of the essential and solely human ability or power of the I think to the animal that is definitionally excluded from access to this pouvoir. Consequently, according to Derrida, Kant's essentially interrelated concepts of war, time, and the I think point to an internal contradiction that grounds and guides the entirety of Kant's discourse. This contradiction and its implications are drastic and profound, extending well into Kantian morality. Following from the rational I think and the human dignity it entails, this morality is predicated upon the paramount, cruel, and evil necessity of animal sacrifice. This sacrifice is as much a sacrifice of l'animaux itself as it is a sacrifice of the animality in man, of pathos, and of compassion, all for the sake of the human, rationality, and the logos. In their dependence on such sacrifice, Kant's human dignity and morality find themselves involved in a Derridian war against l'animaux and compassion. Derrida notes that this sacrificial war, rooted in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, is not only manifested in the technologically driven alteration of animals in the event of the past 2 centuries, but is also constitutive of the very possibility of technoscientific knowledge that gives rise to this event. In its contributions to the sacrificial war, Kantian morality requires sacrificial blood for its sustenance, the blood of l'animal as much as the blood of mortality itself, and it conceals and spills this blood under the guise of the good. For Derrida, however, this blood-drenched goodness can hardly be called good. On the contrary, it represents what any sensible person would unhesitatingly call cruel and evil. Following his own suggestion to reinterpret Kantian thinking regarding evil from this point of view, Derrida concludes his deconstruction of Kant's discourse in a culminatory and centrally important remark. Quote, "One can say, finally, that this unthought in the I think, where the animal that I am following follows me from the place of the other or of the unconscious, is indeed a function of machinality, which haunts the Cartesian concept of animal-machine as much as the Kantian concept of providence, of a providential machine, so as to teleologize the history of war machines that are presumed to have a civilizing effect. But then, the state of culture and regular sociality that human wars supposedly lead to would still be the prosecution of a war without mercy against the animal, which should in effect end in a world without animals, without any animal worthy of the name and living for something other than to become a means for man, livestock, tool, meat, body, or experimental life form. Ultimately, then, the I think condemns the animal as a root other to the realm of the unthought, where l'animal remains thoughtless, unconscious, and unworthy of being thought of. At the same time, the I think belongs to the rational animal, and so a human who has it is in part constituted by the animality of l'animal. When Derrida says that the animal that I am following follows me from the place of the other, he recognizes and inquires into his own animality as a root other, present in him also as a non-other at the root of his own self. The othering of this simultaneously other, non-other animality by the I think to the unthought is a phenomenon arising from the same machinality that generates Descartes' animal machine and Kant's providential machine. Accordingly, this mechanistic othering to the unthought substantiates a teleological naturalization of the history of war machines, by which Derrida's sacrificial war is seen as a designed and inevitable process of the story and history of the human, destined to the technical and technological advancements of human war machines that should propel the human forward into a more civilized and modernized era. In its most fruitful and climactic era, this sacrificial war would lead to the extinction of the animality of animals, where there would no longer be animals, but only unthought living objects for human production, consumption, profit, and unrepentant progress. As has been shown, Derrida's deconstruction of Kant is centrally concerned with compassion by way of the concepts of pouvoir, war, sacrifice, time, and technology. Kant defines the essence of the human as distinct from the animal in the ability or power of the I think. This pouvoir of the I think arises from the divine mechanism of war that brings the human away from the state of nature towards civility in a process that is categorized into eras of time in the story and history of the human. At the same time, this war in the I think necessitates the sacrifice of l'animaux and animality, and in turn the sacrifice of compassion. Following its mechanistic ordinance, the war propels the human toward technological advancements that accelerate and amplify the sacrificial war against l'animaux, with the end goal of an era or event that aims to be free of animals, animality, l'animaux, and the possibility of compassion. It is in a similar context of war that Derrida invokes Levinas' story of Bobby, the Kantian dog, which is linked with Levinas' central emphasis on the face of the other. For Levinas, the face of the other is what guides his ethics as first philosophy, where any human subject is held hostage by the fraternal face of the other who says, "Do not kill me, thou shalt not kill." The question of the gaze between the self and the face of the other precedes all other ontological and metaphysical questions. This face, in its vulnerable state of nudity, is meant to represent the other in all of its alterity, and to subvert the subject in its obligation to and constitution by the face of the other. It is with this face in mind that Derrida locates the entirety of his text within the interspecific gaze that emerges when his cat catches and sees him in a most vulnerable and shameful state of nudity, as his cat observes him frontally naked, face to face, faced with the cat's eyes looking at him in the incomparable and original experience of appearing in truth naked in front of the insistent gaze of the animal. It is within the context of this gaze, within this gaze itself, that Derrida faces Levinas' story of Bobby, the Kantian dog, and asks whether the Levinasian animal, a non-human animal other, has the right to be called a face. In Derrida's interpretation, the resounding answer found throughout Levinas' work, in spite of Levinas' proclaimed inability to respond to the question, is a simple no. This is a no that can be heard in this response in the form of a non-response similar to the non-response of a dead animal who would never have been able to respond. Unlike the human, the animal would never have had the ability or power to respond, and hence, the animal would be deprived as much of this pouvoir as the responsibility and the right of non-response that is accorded to the human face. In this logic, the other of the other is not an other than the human, other than the other human. Accordingly, the face of the other remains the face of a human other and not the animal other. Yet Derrida is surprised by this. For a thinking of the other, of the infinitely other who looks at him, should on the contrary privilege the question and request of the animal in a way that would not prioritize the animal, but in fact would think that of man, of the brother and the neighbor. It is by thinking only of the human other that the discourses of Descartes, Kant, and Levinas speak of l'animal in a way that leaves it disavowed, foreclosed, sacrificed, and humiliated when they deny to l'animal everything they attribute to the human. What is most important here is that Derrida links Levinas' discourse to those of Descartes and Kant through their similar uses of pouvoir and sacrifice. In all cases, l'animal is sacrificed due to its lack of ability or power to access what is distinctly human. In the case of Levinas, the animal cannot have a face, cannot say, "Do not kill me," and is thus sacrificially excluded from any human responsibility or duty towards the other. Much like Descartes and Kant, Levinas disavows the alterity of l'animal in a way that recognizes this alterity while sacrificing it to the more important and central concern of human subjectivity. Accordingly, Levinas' discourse finds itself in the same sacrificial war as those of Descartes and Kant and the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. We now turn to the actual story of Bobby, the Kantian dog, which I will relay in Levinas' own words. Before that, just a few quick notes. I do think this is autobiographical, as Levinas was indeed an actual prisoner of war, but I'm not entirely sure on that point. If you happen to know for sure, please let me know in the comments, because I would love to know for sure. Also, I would recommend reading the rest of this essay, as it's about 2 pages and you'll get a lot out of it. You can just Google it and find a PDF. With that said, here is Emmanuel Levinas, The Name of a Dog. There were 70 of us in a forestry commando unit for Jewish prisoners of war in Nazi Germany. But the other men, called free, who had dealings with us or gave us work or orders or even a smile, stripped us of our human skin. We were subhuman, a gang of apes. A small inner murmur, the strength and wretchedness of persecuted people, reminded us of our essence as thinking creatures, but we were no longer part of the world. And then, about halfway through our long captivity, for a few short weeks before the sentinels chased him away, a wandering dog entered our lives. One day he came to meet this rabble as we returned under guard from work. He survived in some wild patch in the region of the camp, but we called him Bobby, an exotic name, as one does with a cherished dog. He would appear at morning assembly and was waiting for us as we returned, jumping up and down and barking in delight. For him, there was no doubt that we were men. Here, we were nowhere. This dog was the last Kantian in Nazi Germany, without the brain needed to universalize maxims and drives. For Derrida, Bobby the Kantian dog finds itself in a sort of hapax as the last Kantian in Nazi Germany. In the words of Levinas, there was no doubt we were men. In the Kantian fashion, Bobby unhesitatingly recognizes the human dignity of these prisoners of war. At the same time, however, Levinas makes sure to note that Bobby is without the brain needed to universalize the maxims for drives, and thus, in spite of his being a Kantian, Bobby is anything but a Kantian. Additionally, recalling Kant's cruel and merciless war against l'animal, Derrida notes that calling Bobby a Kantian is no compliment. Indeed, the story of Bobby is doing something else, even the exact contrary of what Levinas says or means to say, for the sole purpose of this dog is merely to attest to the dignity of man, while remaining, in Levinas's words, with neither ethics nor logos, the friend of man, recognizing the human dignity of the prisoners who themselves were subhuman, a gang of apes. In a discourse intended to subvert the subject, Bobby and l'animal remain, according to Derrida, too other to be our brother or neighbor, not enough other to be the wholly other, the nakedness of whose face dictates to us, thou shalt not kill. Even Levinas's subversion of the subject is not enough to see anything in the animal except something other than a deprivation of humanity. The animal, following the Cartesian tradition, remains a machine that doesn't speak, that doesn't have access to sense, precisely what the Nazis sought to reduce their prisoners to. Contrary to their aims, Levinas and his ethics as first philosophy remain wholly bound to the Cartesian and Kantian traditions of a subject in a sacrificial war against l'animal. Bobby and l'animal remain sacrificed as mere means subservient to the ends of human rationality, dignity, and the logos. The animal and animality, in all of their alterity, remain others that must be excluded from ethical responsibility and obligation, superseded by the ethical prioritization of the thinking human subject. This is why Jewish prisoners in Nazi death camps who have lost all their ethical rights are only subhuman, a gang of apes. The ethical question of the face of the other becomes once again the prioritization of the question of animal thought over the question of animal suffering, the prioritization of the logos over the pathos, pity, and compassion. Inevitably, Levinas's ethics as first philosophy remains entrapped in and continues to contribute to the mechanistically driven, sacrificial war against l'animal and compassion, guiding the story and history of the human toward the aforementioned technocratic era or event free of animality, l'animal, and the possibility of compassion. It is noteworthy that this fateful era of Descartes, Kant's, and Levinas's war resembles what earlier in the text Derrida calls, quote, the tableau of a world after animality, after a sort of holocaust, a world from which animality, at first present to man, would have one day disappeared, destroyed or annihilated by man, either purely and simply or by means of a devitalizing or disanimalizing treatment, what others would call the denaturing of animality, the production of figures of animality that are so new that they appear monstrous enough to call for a change of name. It also resembles another tableau, like that of the aforementioned terrifying and intolerable realist painting of the industrial, mechanical, chemical, hormonal, and genetic violence to which man has been submitting animal life for the past 2 centuries, which he also characterizes as a sort of holocaust. Between these 2 tableaus, the only tableaus in the entire text, this anticipatory era and the event of the past 2 centuries are blurred into one, painting an ideological and tangible reality that can be attributed in great part to the collective discourse which unifies Descartes, Kant, Levinas, but also so many others. It is in the midst of this event that Derrida finds himself, naked and vulnerable, entrapped in the inescapable gaze of his cat. And as their 2 pairs of eyes peer into one another, questions of morality and ethics emerge among countless others, like a call, a cry, a confusion, pleading for a response. These questions point to the insensible cruelty which Derrida found not only in the discourse of Descartes, Kant, and Levinas as they pervert themselves under the guise of goodness, but also in the actual event that is well underway today. This goodness and the event are soaked in the sacrificial blood of a war against animals, animality, and l'animal. Today, this war is in a critical era, characterized by the event of factory farming, its unprecedented and untamable technological methods, and the extreme sacrificial disavowal of compassion that these entail as much ideologically as they do practically. The amount of actual human and non-human animal blood and suffering that sustain this technocratic world of war are immeasurable, unbearable, and unanswerable. As the human comes face to face with l'animal in the ongoing procession and acceleration of this event, perhaps even seeing in its eyes something like a face begging not to be killed, all ethical and moral questions call for a revolution in paradigm and behavior. In such a revolution, the human, with l'animal in heart and mind, may finally and decidedly conclude that we must follow and live by something like the word compassion. Until this revolution comes, the world will continue to strive for a world free of l'animal, free of compassion, and ultimately, free of the human animal. So if you've made it this far, I just want to say thank you so much for tuning in. I truly do appreciate it. Appreciate being able to share my thoughts with the world. I really hope you got something out of this. If you did, let me know in the comments, or if you have any thoughts or questions, feel free to share them, and I'll be glad to get back to you guys, start some kind of discussion. But other than that, that's about it. You guys have a blessed day and a blessed life. Farewell.